The letter that changed everything. Written and read by the author, Kara Jones. Mia stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, staring up into the darkness. It was the last room in the house she hadn't touched. The one place she'd avoided since her father passed away 6 months ago. The rest of the house, every room, every drawer, had been thoroughly cleaned and packed away. But the attic, it had too much. The house, now empty of life, echoed with memories. This had been her childhood home, the place where she'd learned to ride a bike, hosted sleepovers with her sister Laura, and celebrated Christmas with her parents. But it was also the house where silence often hung heavy, where her father had retreated into himself, and where unspoken tension had settled like dust. Mia's hand hesitated on the pull cord. She sighed and gave it a firm tug. The attic ladder unfolded with a creak, revealing the shadowy space above. A wave of musty air greeted her as she climbed, flashlight in hand, into a place she hadn't ventured since she was a teenager. The attic was as she remembered, cluttered and chaotic. Boxes were stacked haphazardly. Old furniture leaned against the walls, and cobwebs stretched like delicate curtains. The beam of her flashlight caught a collection of faded holiday decorations and a row of her mother's old sewing supplies. She didn't know where to begin. Her father had always been adamant about keeping his attic his domain. "Too much history up there," he'd say whenever she asked about it. Now, as she stood among the remnants of his life, she understood what he meant. Mia reached for a box labeled Dad's Office and opened it cautiously. Inside were neatly folded documents, faded photos, and journals she didn't recognize. She flipped through them quickly, hoping for something familiar, but it was mostly old tax records and meeting notes. Then, tucked at the bottom of the box, she saw it, a wooden chest no bigger than a shoebox. Its hinges were rusted, the wood scratched and weathered. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't remember seeing it before, and something about it felt significant. She knelt down, brushing off the dust with her sleeve, and gently pried it open. Inside were a few small trinkets, an old pocket watch, a set of cufflinks, and an envelope so yellowed with age it seemed ready to crumble. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. Her father's handwriting sprawled across the front in dark, looping letters. It was addressed to someone she didn't know. Helen. Mia's breath caught. She flipped the envelope over, her thumb tracing the edge of the seal. It had been opened before, but it still felt private, forbidden somehow. "Who's Helen?" she whispered aloud, as though the attic might answer her. Her curiosity won. Carefully, she pulled the letter free. The paper was brittle, the ink slightly smudged, but the words were legible. "Dear Helen, I've carried this secret for too long. I don't know how to begin explaining, but I need you to understand why I made the choices I did. I was too ashamed to tell you when it mattered, but I hope this letter finds you someday. Maybe then you'll know that I loved you both, even if I couldn't show it the way I should have." The letter ended abruptly, mid-thought, with a blot of ink where the pen must have paused too long. Mia stared at the page, her mind racing. Loved you both? Who was Helen? And what secret had her father been too ashamed to share? She sat back on her heels, the letter clenched in her hands. Her father had always been distant, but now that distance felt deliberate, as though he'd been keeping this part of himself locked away. Mia folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the chest. Her hand shook as she closed the lid. This wasn't just a letter. It was a key to something much bigger. Chapter 2, Unraveling the Past. The letter stayed with Mia, not just physically, but emotionally. She couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying the words over and over in her mind. The next morning, she called Laura. "You're still cleaning the house?" Laura asked when she picked up, her voice distant. "I found something," Mia said, cutting straight to the point. "Okay," Laura sounded wary. "It's a letter Dad wrote, but it's not addressed to Mom or either of us. It's just someone named Helen." There was a long pause on the other side of that line. "Mia, what are you talking about?" "I think it's something important. He mentioned a secret, something he couldn't tell her or us." "Mia," Laura sighed heavily, "Dad's gone. What's the point of digging all this up now?" "Because I need to know," Mia snapped, surprising herself with the sharpness of her tone. "Don't you ever wonder why he was the way he was? Why he never talked about his family?" "No," Laura said flatly, "I don't. And I don't think you should either. Let it go." The call ended with tension, crackling in the air, but Mia couldn't let it go. Chapter 3, The Box of Secrets. Mia spent the rest of the day thinking about Laura's words. Let it go. As if she could. The letter was like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere in her understanding of their father. She knew she wouldn't find peace until she understood what it meant. Back in her living room, Mia placed the wooden chest on the coffee table. She pulled out the letter again and read it, this time more slowly. The words echoed in her mind. "I loved you both, even if I couldn't show it." She turned the letter over, searching for more, but there was nothing. Frustrated, she turned her attention to the other items in the chest, the pocket watch, the cufflinks, and a small bundle of photographs wrapped in faded twine. Mia untied the bundle carefully, her heart racing. The photos were old, black and white snapshots of people she didn't recognize. One showed a young woman sitting on the hood of a classic car, her hair pinned up in loose curls. She had a radiant smile, and on the back, written in the same handwriting as the letter, was a single word: Helen. The next photo showed the same woman holding hands with a man, Mia's father. He looked younger, happier, and more carefree than she'd ever seen him. They stood in front of a modest house with a picket fence, their faces lit with smiles. Mia's chest tightened. Who was Helen? A girlfriend before her mother? A secret wife? The possibilities swirled in her mind, and with them, a growing sense of unease. What if her father's life had been far more complicated than she ever imagined? She placed the photos down and opened her laptop. If Helen had meant enough to her father to keep these moments, maybe she was still out there, or someone who knew her was. Mia typed Helen into a search engine, but she quickly realized she didn't have enough information to go on. She sighed and shut the laptop. For now, the letter and photos would have to do. Chapter 4, The Conversation That Wasn't. The following week, Mia invited Laura over. Her sister arrived reluctantly, her arms crossed as she stepped into the house. "This better not be about the letter," Laura said as she sat on the couch. "It is," Mia replied, handing her the photos without preamble. Laura's brow frowned as she flipped through them. "Who is this?" she asked, holding up the picture of Helen. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Mia said. "It's Dad and someone named Helen. He kept these photos hidden in a chest, along with the letter." Laura set the photos down and leaned back. So what? People have pasts, Mia. Maybe she was just some old girlfriend. Why do you care? Because he mentioned a secret in the letter, Mia said, her voice rising. A secret he never told us. Don't you think that matters? Laura shook her head. Dad's gone. He's not here to explain, and digging this up won't change anything. It changes everything, Mia snapped. Don't you want to understand him? Don't you want to know why he was so distant? Why he never talked about his family? Laura stood abruptly. No, Mia, I don't. I don't need to understand someone who's not here anymore. If you want to waste your time on this, fine, but leave me out of it. Mia watched as her sister stormed out. The door slammed shut, and for a moment, the house was filled with heavy silence. Mia sank onto the couch, clutching the letter in her hands. She didn't understand why Laura refused to care, but she couldn't let it go. Chapter 5: The Search for Helen. The next day, Mia took the letter and photos to the local library. The librarian, a kind older woman named Miss Harris, greeted her with a warm smile. What can I help you with today? Said Miss Harris. I'm trying to track someone down, Mia said, handing over the photo of Helen. This is from the 1950s, I think. Her name was Helen, and she might have lived around here. Miss Harris examined the photo carefully. Well, we can check the city directories and old newspapers. Sometimes they list residents and events from that time. They spent hours combing through records. At first, Mia felt hopeful, but as the hours dragged on, with no results, her spirits sank. Finally, Miss Harris pulled out a faded yearbook from the local high school, dated 1953. Let's see if she's in here, Miss Harris said. Mia's heart raced as they flipped through the pages. And then there she was, Helen, smiling brightly in her senior portrait. The caption read, Helen Carter, Future Homemaker of the Year. She's real, Mia whispered. Miss Harris smiled. Now you've got a last name. That should help you narrow your search. Mia took a photo of the yearbook page with her phone, thanking Miss Harris profusely. Armed with a full name, she felt one step closer to the truth. Chapter 6: The Truth Comes to Light. Back at home, Mia drove into her search. This time, the pieces started coming together. She found an obituary for Helen Carter, who had passed away 2 years ago. The obituary mentioned her children and grandchildren, as well as her work as a school teacher in the same town where Mia's father had grown up. But what struck Mia most was a line buried in the middle of the text, predeceased by her husband, James, and survived by their daughter, Claire. James. Her father's name was James. Mia stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Could it be? Could Helen and her father have been married? And if so, why had he never mentioned her? Heart pounding, she scribbled down the name Claire. If Helen's daughter was still alive, she might have the answers Mia desperately needed. Chapter 7: The Call. The next day, Mia picked up the phone and dialed the number she found for Claire. Her hands trembled as she held the phone into her ear. It rang twice before a voice answered. Hello? Hi, is this Claire? Mia asked. Yes, who's this? Mia took a deep breath. My name is Mia. I I think our fathers might be connected. Could we meet? There was a long pause. Connected how? I'm not sure yet, Mia admitted, but I found a letter in my father's attic. He mentioned your mother, Helen. Silence stretched on the line before Claire finally said, I think we should talk. Chapter 8: The Meeting. Mia sat in the corner booth of a small coffee shop, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. She stared out the window, watching the steady stream of people passing by, her nerves tightening with each passing second. When the doorbell chimed, Mia's head snapped toward the entrance. A woman in her late 40s walked in, scanning the room. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose bun, and her face held a mix of curiosity and caution. It had to be Claire. Mia stood and waved, forcing a smile. Claire walked over, her steps hesitant but deliberate. "You must be Mia," Claire said, her voice guarded but kind. "That's me." Mia extended her hand. Claire shook it briefly before sliding into the booth across from her. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. "So," Claire began, breaking the tension, "you said something about a letter?" Mia nodded and pulled the envelope from her bag. She carefully unfolded the letter and passed it across the table. Claire read the letter slowly, her brow frowning as she reached the end. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with confusion and something else Mia couldn't quite place. "This is my mother's name," Claire said softly. "And James, that's your father?" "Yes," Mia replied. I think they might have been married." Claire leaned back, her expression unreadable. "He never mentioned her? Never said anything about us?" Mia shook her head. "Not once. My father was distant. He never talked about his past. I didn't even know this letter existed until I found it in the attic." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "That sounds about right. My mother was the same way. She never talked about him, not really. She only ever said he was a complicated man." Mia's heart ached at the words. "I don't understand. If they were married, why did he leave? Why didn't he tell me?" "I wish I knew," Claire said. Her voice tingled with sadness. "Maybe together we can figure it out." Chapter 9. The Stories They Shared. Over the next hour, Mia and Claire traded pieces of their father's lives, like fragments of a puzzle slowly coming together. Claire told Mia about her mother, Helen, a vibrant and ambitious woman who had married James right out of high school. They had a daughter, Claire, but their marriage fell apart when Claire was a toddler. "He left," Claire said simply. "One day, he just walked out. My mother said it was because he couldn't handle the responsibility. She never forgave him for it." Mia listened, her stomach twisting. She thought of her own childhood, the moments when her father seemed present in body but absent in spirit. "My father was a quiet man," Mia said. "He kept everything locked away. I used to think it was because he didn't care, but now I'm not so sure." Claire nodded. "I think he cared. I think he just didn't know how to show it. My mother was the same way. She carried so much anger, but underneath it, I think she still loved him." They fell silent, both women lost in thought. Finally, Mia spoke. "Do you think we'll ever know the full story?" Claire smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but at least now we have each other." Chapter 10. The Journal. A week later, Claire called Mia with news. "I found something," Claire said, with her voice tingled with excitement. "It's an old journal. I think it belonged to your father." Mia's heart raced. "Where did you find it?" "My mother kept a box of his things. She never got rid of it, even after all these years. I thought it was just old photos and letters, but the journal was tucked inside." They met the next day at Claire's house, a cozy bungalow filled with family photos and warm light. Claire handed Mia the journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. Mia opened it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized her father's handwriting. The first entry was dated 1960, a year after Claire's parents had divorced. "I don't know where to begin. I've made so many mistakes. Leaving Helen, leaving Claire. It haunts me every day. But what haunts me more is the thought of staying and hurting them even more. Tears blurred Mia's vision as she read. The entries were raw and honest, filled with regret and self-recrimination. Her father had struggled deeply, torn between his love for his family and his fear of failing them. One entry stood out. I thought leaving would make things better, but all it did was create more pain. I want to tell Claire and Mia the truth someday, but I don't know if I have the courage. Mia closed the journal, her hands trembling. He wanted to tell us, she whispered. He just didn't know how. Claire placed a hand on Mia's shoulder. Maybe he couldn't find the words then, but we can find them now. We can tell his story and ours. Chapter 11, Healing the Roots. Over the next few months, Mia and Claire worked together to piece together their father's lives. They visited old family homes, spoke to distant relatives, and unearthed truths that had been buried for decades. In the process, they found healing, not just for themselves, but for the wounds their father had left behind. Mia wrote letters to Laura, apologizing for the distance between them and inviting her to be a part of the journey. Slowly, cautiously, Laura began to open up. Claire shared her findings with her own children, passing down the lessons she had learned. And together, Mia and Claire wrote a book, a tribute to their father's struggles and the resilience of the family he left behind. Final words, a legacy of forgiveness. Years later, Mia stood in her father's attic once again, this time with her own daughter by her side. Mom, her daughter said, holding up the old wooden chest. What's this? Mia smiled. It's a long story, she said, but it's a good one. As they sat together, Mia began to share the tale of the letter that had changed everything. And through her words, the legacy of forgiveness lived on. The end.